Far from the great river valleys where many of the earliest civilizations took shape, the land that would one day be known as Persia unfolded across a vast and varied landscape, a region defined not by a single lifeline of water, but by contrast, by mountains rising in long, jagged chains, by open plateaus stretching toward distant horizons, and by deserts that seemed to absorb both sound and movement, creating a world that demanded careful understanding rather than simple adaptation. And it was within this environment that the early peoples of the Iranian plateau began to shape their lives, forming patterns of settlement, movement, and survival that would later support one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen. The Iranian plateau, extending across what is now modern Iran and parts of surrounding regions, was framed by powerful natural boundaries. To the west lay the Zagros Mountains, rugged and deeply folded, forming a barrier that separated the plateau from the fertile lands of Mesopotamia, while to the north the Alborz Mountains rose sharply, their peaks often capped with snow, shielding the interior from the influences of the Caspian Sea. And to the east and south, vast desert regions such as the Dashti Kabir and the Dashti Lut created expanses of arid land where life was sparse and movement was difficult. And yet, within these boundaries, the plateau itself offered pockets of fertility, valleys where water collected, highlands where seasonal grazing was possible, and routes that connected distant regions through narrow passes and open plains. Unlike the steady, predictable floods of the Nile or the Tigris and Euphrates, water in this land was uncertain, appearing in springs, seasonal streams, and underground channels, and the people who lived here learned to rely not on a single source, but on a network of smaller, scattered resources, developing methods of water management that would later become one of the defining features of Persian engineering, including the Qanat system, a technique of tapping underground aquifers and channeling water across long distances through gently sloping tunnels, allowing communities to access reliable water even in arid regions. And though this innovation would reach its full development in later periods, its roots lay in the early understanding that survival depended on careful planning and cooperation. The climate of the plateau added another layer of complexity, for summers could be intensely hot, with dry winds sweeping across the land, while winters, particularly in the higher regions, brought cold temperatures and occasional snow, creating a cycle that required flexibility. And this environment encouraged a semi-nomadic way of life for many early groups, who moved with their herds of sheep, goat, and cattle, following seasonal patterns that allowed them to make use of different grazing lands throughout the year. And these movements created networks of knowledge, routes that were remembered and shared, linking different parts of the plateau through repeated journeys. Among these early populations were groups that spoke languages belonging to the Indo-Iranian branch of the Indo-European family, and over time, some of these groups, often referred to as the early Iranian peoples, began to settle more permanently in certain regions, forming communities that combined pastoral traditions with agriculture, cultivating crops such as wheat and barley in areas where water was available, and raising animals that provided both food and materials, creating a balanced way of life that could respond to the uncertainties of the environment. The geography of the plateau also shaped patterns of interaction, for while the mountains and deserts created natural barriers, they also defined pathways, guiding along certain routes, and these routes became channels of exchange, allowing goods, ideas, and cultural practices to move between regions, connecting the Iranian plateau to neighboring areas such as Mesopotamia, Central Asia, and the Indus Valley. And through these connections, the early inhabitants of Persia were not isolated, but part of a broader network of interaction that influenced their development. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Susa, located near the western edge of the plateau, shows that even in the early periods, there was contact with the civilizations of Mesopotamia, with shared styles of pottery, tools, and administrative practices, suggesting that the exchange of ideas was as important as the exchange of goods. And over time, these interactions contributed to the development of more complex social structures within the region, as communities grew larger and more organized. The climate also influenced how people understood the world around them, For in a land where survival depended on balance and awareness, there was a strong sense of respect for natural forces, for the sun that provided warmth and light, for water that sustained life, and for the land itself, which could offer both abundance and hardship. And these elements would later be reflected in the belief systems that emerged within the region, particularly in the emphasis on order, truth, and the balance between opposing forces, concepts that would become central to the spiritual traditions of Persia. The communities became more settled. Early forms of social organization began to appear, with leaders emerging who could coordinate activities, manage resources, and maintain harmony within the group. And these roles were not defined by absolute power, but by responsibility, by the ability to guide and to protect. And over time, these forms of leadership would evolve into more formal structures, laying the groundwork for the development of kingdoms and eventually an empire. The climation of the Iranian plateau also placed it at a crossroads between different regions, and this position would become increasingly important as trade expanded. For the plateau could serve as a bridge between East and West, between the civilizations of Mesopotamia and those of Central and South Asia. And to this role, the region became a place of movement and exchange, where different influences could meet and interact, creating a cultural landscape that was both diverse and interconnected. Despite the challenges of the environment, or perhaps because of them, the people of this land developed a resilience and adaptability that would later support the growth of a powerful and expansive state, for they were accustomed to managing limited resources, to coordinating efforts across distances, and to navigating a landscape that required both knowledge and patience, and these skills would become essential as the scale of their society increased. In time, from these scattered communities, shaped by mountains, deserts, and the open sky, there would emerge leaders who sought not only to manage their own regions, but to bring together many lands under a single system, creating an empire that would stretch across continents, connecting diverse peoples through shared structures and ideas. And this transformation would not happen suddenly, but would build upon the foundations laid by generations who had learned to live in harmony with the challenging yet sustaining environment. The climate and the quiet expanses of the Iranian plateau, where the wind moves across the land and the horizon seems to extend without end. The early story of Persia begins, not with monuments or conquests, but with understanding, with the careful observation of the world, and with the steady development of ways of life that could endure. And in this beginning, we can see the first threads of the civilization that would one day shape the course of history, carried forward by the people who learned to live within the balance of land, water, and time. In the quiet stretches of the Iranian plateau, where scattered communities lived across valleys and highlands, bound more by shared language and tradition than by political unity, the world was still divided into many small regions, each with its own leaders, its own customs, and its own rhythms of life. And yet, beneath this apparent separation, there were connections forming, connections shaped by trade, by movement, and by the shared challenges of the land. And it was within this world of growing interaction that a transformation began to take shape, a movement from local rule toward something far larger, guided by the emergence of a leader whose influence would extend far beyond his own homeland. Before the rise of Persia as a unified power, the region was inhabited by various groups often referred to as the Iranian peoples, among them the Medes and the Persians, who shared cultural and linguistic ties but were organized into separate political entities, and the Medes, occupying the western regions of the plateau, had already begun to form a significant kingdom, with their capital at Ecbatana, while the Persians lived further south in the region known as Anshan, a land of valleys and highlands where pastoral and agricultural life continued much as it had for generations. The Persians, though smaller in power compared to the Medes, were not isolated, for they maintained connections through trade and alliances, and over time, they developed their own sense of identity, shaped by both their environment and their interactions with neighboring peoples. And it was within this context that a figure emerged who would change the course of their history, a leader known to us as Cyrus, later remembered as Cyrus the Great. The origins of Cyrus are preserved in a blend of historical records and later tradition, some of which carry the tone of legend, for stories describe his birth as marked by prophecy, with fears that he would one day challenge established authority, and though such accounts reflect the way later generations understood his significance, what remains clear is that Cyrus rose to leadership within the Persian community and began to reshape its position within the wider region. This time of Cyrus's rise, the Medes held a position of dominance over the Persians, and the relationship between the two was one of hierarchy rather than equality. Yet this balance would not remain unchanged, for Cyrus, through a combination of leadership, strategy, and the support of his followers, began to challenge Median authority, and in a series of events that are recorded in ancient sources, he led a successful revolt against the Median king Astyages, bringing the two peoples under a single rule. This unification marked a turning point, for it created a foundation upon which a much larger political structure could be built, and rather than dismantling the existing systems of the Medes, Cyrus incorporated them, maintaining elements of their administration and culture while placing them within a broader framework. And this approach, one of integration rather than replacement, would become a defining characteristic of his rule. With the consolidation of power across the Iranian plateau, Cyrus turned his attention outward toward neighboring regions that were themselves part of a network of ancient civilizations, and one of the first major expansions of his rule came with the conquest of Lydia, a kingdom located in western Anatolia, known for its wealth and its advanced systems of trade. And in bringing Lydia under his control, Cyrus not only extended his territory, but also gained access to important economic resources and connections. Perhaps the most significant moment in Cyrus's expansion came with the conquest of Babylon, one of the great cities of Mesopotamia, a center of culture, religion, and administration that had stood for centuries. And unlike many conquests of the ancient world, the entry of Cyrus into Babylon is described in terms that emphasize order rather than destruction. Records such as the Cyrus cylinder present him as a ruler who restored temples, respected local traditions, and allowed displaced peoples to return to their homelands, including the well-known example of the Jewish population, who were permitted to return to Jerusalem. This approach to governance, which emphasized respect for local customs and the inclusion of diverse populations, set Cyrus apart from many rulers of his time, for rather than imposing a single culture or system, he allowed a degree of autonomy within the regions he controlled, creating a structure that could accommodate diversity while maintaining overall unity. And this flexibility made it possible to govern a vast and varied empire. As the territories under his rule expanded, the need for organization became more pronounced, and systems began to develop that would allow communication, administration, and control to function across great distances. And while many of these systems would be further refined by his successors, the foundations laid during Cyrus's reign established the principles of governance that would define the Persian Empire. The idea of kingship also took on new meaning during this period, where the ruler was not only a political leader, but a figure who represented order and stability across the land. And in the inscriptions and records of the time, there is an emphasis on justice, on the proper treatment of subjects, and on the responsibility of the king to maintain harmony, reflecting a view of leadership that combined authority with duty. The rise of Cyrus and the unification of lands under his rule did not simply create a larger state, but introduced a new way of thinking about empire, one that was based on connection rather than uniformity, on the management of diversity rather than its suppression, and on the understanding that stability could be achieved through cooperation as much as through control. This new form of empire, stretching across regions that had long developed independently, required not only military success, but also administrative skill, cultural awareness, and the ability to adapt to different conditions. And in the sense, the achievements of Cyrus were not limited to conquest, but extended to the creation of a system that could endure. In the years that followed, the empire would continue to grow and evolve, shaped by the contributions of later rulers who would build upon the foundations established during this period. but the role of Cyrus remained central, for it was his leadership that transformed a collection of communities into a unified power, setting in motion a process that would influence the history of the ancient world. And so, from the highlands and valleys of the Iranian plateau, from a land shaped by contrast and resilience, there emerged a new force, one that would connect distant regions and bring together diverse peoples under a shared system. And in this transformation, the story of Persia moved from its quiet beginnings into a broader stage, guided by the vision and actions of a leader whose legacy would be remembered across centuries. With the unification of the Persian and Median lands, and the steady expansion under the leadership of Cyrus, the foundation of a vast political structure had been established. Yet what had begun as a regional consolidation soon moved beyond the boundaries of the Iranian plateau, reaching into lands that had long been centers of ancient civilization. And in this expansion, Persia transformed from a powerful kingdom into one of the first truly transcontinental empires, connecting regions that had developed independently into a single system of governance and exchange. This early expansion of the Persian Empire did not occur as a series of isolated campaigns, but as part of a broader vision, one that recognized the importance of key regions, trade routes, and of cultural centers. And as Cyrus moved westward, the conquest of Lydia not only extended Persian influence into Anatolia, but also brought the empire into contact with Greek city-states along the coast, creating new relationships that would shape future interactions. And the capture of Sardis, the Lydian capital, marked a significant moment, for it provided access to wealth, resources, and a network of trade that connected the eastern Mediterranean with inland regions. Following the incorporation of Lydia, attention turned toward Babylon, a city that held immense significance in the ancient world, not only as a political center, but as a place of knowledge, tradition, and administration. And when Cyrus entered Babylon, the transition of power was marked by a degree of continuity, where the existing administrative systems were largely maintained, and local officials continued to play roles within the new structure, reflecting an approach that valued stability and integration over disruption. The expansion of the empire continued under Cyrus's successors, particularly Cambyses's Roman II, who extended Persian control into Egypt, bringing one of the oldest and most established civilizations under the authority of the empire. And this expansion further increased the diversity of the territories under Persian rule, encompassing regions with different languages, traditions, and systems of organization. And with this diversity came the need for more refined methods of governance. It was during the reign of Darius I, often known as Cyrus the Great, that the structure of the empire reached a new level of organization, for he undertook reforms that transformed the administration of the vast territories into a system that could be managed effectively across great distances. And one of the most significant of these reforms was the division of the empire into provinces, known as satrapies, each governed by an official called a satrap, who was responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining and overseeing local administration. This system allowed the empire to maintain a balance between central authority and local autonomy, for while the satraps acted on behalf of the king, they also worked within the context of local traditions and practices, ensuring that governance was both effective and adaptable. And to prevent the concentration of power, the satraps were often monitored by other officials, including military commanders and royal inspectors, sometimes referred to as the king's eyes and ears, who reported directly to the central authority. Communication across the empire was supported by the development of an extensive road network, most notably the Royal Road, which stretched from Susa in the east to Sardis in the west, covering a distance of over 2,000 kilometers. And along this route, relay stations were established where messengers could rest and exchange horses, allowing information to travel quickly and efficiently. And the system ensured that the king could maintain contact with distant regions, receiving reports and issuing instructions in a timely manner. The Persian Empire also developed a standardized system of taxation, with each satrapy responsible for contributing a set amount of resources, often based on the productivity and wealth of the region, and these contributions were used to support the administration, the construction of infrastructure, and the maintenance of the royal court. And while taxation was a common feature of ancient states, the Persian system was notable for its organization and consistency. In addition to administrative and economic systems, the empire also invested in large-scale construction projects, particularly under Darius, who established new capitals such as Persepolis, a ceremonial center that reflected the wealth and diversity of the empire, with reliefs depicting representatives from different regions bringing tribute, symbolizing the unity of the empire under a single ruler. And these structures were not only functional, but also symbolic, reinforcing the authority of the king and the cohesion of the empire. The diversity of the empire was one of its defining characteristics, for it included peoples from many different cultural backgrounds, each with their own languages, beliefs, and traditions. And rather than imposing a single cultural identity, the Persian approach was to allow these differences to continue, as long as loyalty to the central authority was maintained. And this policy contributed to the stability of the empire, reducing resistance and encouraging cooperation. Trade played an important role in connecting the different regions, as goods moved along established routes, linking the resources of one area with the needs of another. And through this exchange, the empire became an integrated economic system, where the movement of materials, from metals and textiles to agricultural products, supported both local communities and the broader structure of the state. The military, while essential to the expansion of the empire, was also organized in a way that reflected its diversity, with units drawn from different regions, each contributing their own skills and traditions. And among these forces, the group known as the Immortals, and elite corps soldiers, became particularly well known, maintaining a constant number through immediate replacement, and serving as a symbol of the strength and continuity of the empire. As the empire grew, it also came into contact with other powerful cultures, including the Greek city-states, and these interactions would eventually lead to conflict, as differing systems of organization and identity came into opposition. Yet even within these tensions, there was also exchange, as ideas, goods, and influences moved between regions, shaping the development of both sides. The creation of the Persian Empire, through the expansion and organization of its territories, represented a significant moment in history, for it demonstrated the possibility of governing a vast and diverse area through systems that combined central authority with local adaptation. And in doing so, it established a model that would influence later empires, showing that stability could be achieved not only through control, but through integration and cooperation. And so, from its beginnings on the Iranian plateau, the Persian Empire extended outward, connecting lands that had long existed separately. And in this process, it created a network of relationships, of systems, and of shared structures that allowed it to endure, shaping the history of the ancient world and leaving a legacy that would be remembered long after its original form had changed. As the Persian Empire expanded across continents, encompassing lands that had long developed independently, the challenge it faced was not simply one of conquest, but of continuity, for bringing territories under a single authority was only the beginning, and maintaining stability across vast distances required a system that could balance control with flexibility, order with diversity. And it was within this challenge that the Achaemenid system of governance took shape, not as a rigid structure imposed uniformly across the land, but as a carefully organized framework that allowed the empire to function as a connected whole while respecting the uniqueness of each region. The sheer scale of the empire made direct control from a central location impossible, for the distances between its eastern and western boundaries stretched across thousands of kilometers, crossing mountains, deserts, rivers, and cultural divides. And so the solution lay in division, not a separation, but as organization. And the empire was divided into administrative regions known as satrapies, each of which functioned as a manageable unit within the larger system. and at the head of each satrapy stood a governor, the satrap, whose role was to represent the authority of the king while overseeing the daily administration of the region. The satraps were responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining local security, managing resources, and ensuring that the laws of the empire held. Yet their authority was not absolute, for the system included mechanisms designed to prevent the concentration of power, and alongside the satrap, other officials were appointed, including military commanders who controlled the troops within the region, and royal secretaries who maintained records and communication. And this separation of responsibilities created a balance, assuring that no single individual could act without oversight. To further strengthen the system, the empire employed inspectors who traveled between satrapies, often referred to as the king's eyes and ears, and these officials reported directly to the central authority, providing information about the actions of local administrators. And through this network of observation, the king maintained awareness of the conditions across the empire, even in regions far removed from the central court. And this constant flow of information allowed for adjustments, corrections, and the maintenance of order. At the center of the system stood the king, not only as a political leader, but as the symbol of unity across the diverse lands of the empire. And in inscriptions and reliefs, the king is often depicted as the upholder of order, the one who ensures justice, and the one who maintains balance between the forces of stability and disorder. And this role was not merely symbolic, for it guided the actions of the administration, shaping how authority was exercised and how decisions were made. The concept of kingship within the Persian Empire was closely tied to the idea of responsibility, for the king was expected to govern with fairness, to respect the traditions of different peoples, and to ensure that the empire functioned as a harmonious whole. And this approach influenced the policies of the administration, encouraging a degree of tolerance that allowed local customs, languages, and religious practices to continue, as long as they did not disrupt the overall. One of the key elements that supported functioning of the empire was the development of an efficient communication system, for without the ability to send and receive information, the coordination of such a vast territory would have been impossible, and the network of roads, particularly the royal road, played a central role in this process, with relay stations positioned at regular intervals, allowing messengers to travel quickly, carrying official communications across great distances, and the system ensured that the decisions of the central authority could be implemented throughout the empire in a timely manner. The use of written records also became increasingly important, for administration required documentation, and the empire employed scribes who recorded transactions, tax collections, and official orders, using multiple languages to accommodate the diversity of the population. And among these languages, Aramaic became widely used as a common administrative language, facilitating communication across different regions. Astronomically, the empire was supported by a system of taxation that reflected the resources and productivity of each satrapy, and rather than imposing a uniform tax, the contributions were assessed based on local conditions, allowing for a more balanced distribution of responsibility. And these resources were used not only to support the administration, but also to fund construction projects, maintain the army, and sustain the royal court. The introduction of standardized coinage, particularly under Darius I, further enhanced economic integration, for coins such as the gold daric provided a consistent medium of exchange, facilitating trade across the empire, and the standardization allowed merchants to conduct transactions with greater ease, linking distant regions into a connected economic system. The structured projects played a significant role in maintaining the cohesion of the empire, for roads, bridges, canals, and storage facilities were constructed and maintained, supporting both administrative functions and daily life. And among these projects, the canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea stands as an example of the empire's ability to connect different regions through engineering, improving trade routes and communication. The military, while essential for defense and expansion, was also integrated into the administrative system, with forces drawn from different regions, each contributing their own skills and traditions. And this diversity within the military reflected the broader structure of the empire, where unity was achieved through the coordination of different elements rather than their uniformity. This Achaemenid system of governance, with its combination of central authority, regional administration, and cultural tolerance, allowed the empire to maintain stability across a vast and diverse territory, and the system demonstrated that it was possible to create a political structure that could accommodate difference while maintaining order, providing a model that would influence later empires. This carefully balanced system, the Persian Empire, found its strength not in the imposition of a single identity, but in the ability to bring together many identities within a shared framework. And through this approach, it created a form of governance that was both practical and enduring, capable of sustaining one of the largest empires of the ancient world. And so, within the structure of satrapies, roads, records, and communication, the empire was held together, not by force alone, but by organization, by oversight, and by a shared understanding of order. And in the system, the foundations of Persian power were not only maintained, but strengthened, allowing the empire to continue its presence across the lands it connected, shaping the history of the regions within its reach. As the Persian Empire expanded across vast distances, stretching from the valleys of the Indus to the shores of the Aegean, the question of control became not only a matter of authority, but of connection, for an empire of such scale could not be sustained by presence alone, and without reliable communication, decisions made at the center would fade before they reached the edges. And so the strength of the empire came to depend not only on its armies or its rulers, but on the systems that allowed information, goods, and people to move steadily across the land. And it was within this need that one of the most remarkable features of the Persian world took shape, a network of roads and communication that transformed distance from a barrier into a pathway. Among these routes, the most well-known was the Royal Road, a carefully maintained highway that connected the administrative heart of the empire at Susa to the western city of Sardis, spanning over 2,000 kilometers, crossing mountains, plains, and rivers, and along its length were established a series of stations, placed at regular intervals, where messengers could rest, change horses, and continue their journey, allowing communication to travel with a speed that was remarkable for its time. And through the system, messages could move from one end of the empire to the other in a matter of days rather than weeks or months. This framework was not simply a road in the physical sense, but part of a larger system designed to maintain the unity of the empire, where the movement of information was essential to governance. And through these routes, reports from satraps, orders from the king, and records of trade and taxation could flow continuously, creating a sense of connection between distant regions that might otherwise have remained isolated from one another. The efficiency of the system was supported by the organization of the courier service, often described in later sources as operating without delay, regardless of weather or time. And while such descriptions may carry an element of admiration, they reflect the importance placed on reliability, for the ability to communicate quickly allowed the central authority to respond to challenges, to coordinate resources, and to maintain oversight across the empire, assuring that local conditions did not drift too far from the broader framework of order. The roads themselves were constructed and maintained with care, often following routes that had been used for generations, but improved to support more consistent travel. And in some areas, bridges were built to cross rivers, while in others, pathways were cleared through difficult terrain, and these efforts required coordination and labor, drawing upon the resources of different regions to create a system that benefited the whole. Beyond their administrative function, these routes also supported trade, allowing merchants to move goods across long distances, linking regions that produced different resources. And through this exchange, the empire became an interconnected economic system, where materials such as metals, textiles, spices, and agricultural products could be transported from one area to another, creating networks of supply and demand that strengthen the overall stability of the state. The strands moved along these routes, carrying goods across deserts and plains, guided by knowledge of the land and supported by the infrastructure that the empire had established. And along the way, stopping points provided water, shelter, and opportunities for exchange, creating a rhythm of movement that connected communities across distances. And through these journeys, not only goods, but also ideas and cultural practices traveled, contributing to the diversity of the empire. The movement of people along these routes also played an important role, for officials traveled to oversee administration, soldiers moved to reinforce positions or respond to threats, and individuals journeyed for trade, diplomacy, or migration. And in this constant movement, the empire remained dynamic, its different regions linked not only by authority, but by the flow of activity that passed between them. Waterways, too, formed part of this network, particularly in regions where rivers could be navigated, and the construction of canals, such as the one linking the Nile to the Red Sea, further expanded the possibilities of movement, connecting inland regions to maritime routes, and allowing goods to be transported across both land and water, creating a system that extended beyond the boundaries of the empire itself. To support this level of coordination, the empire relied on systems of measurement and record-keeping, ensuring that distances, resources, and transactions could be understood consistently, and through the use of standardized weights, measures, and coinage, trade and administration became more efficient, reducing uncertainty and facilitating interaction between regions. The importance of communication extended beyond practical matters, for it also reinforced the presence of the central authority, reminding distant regions that they were part of a larger system. And through the regular flow of messages, the king's influence remained present, even in areas far removed from the capital, creating a sense of unity that was both physical and symbolic. The straight movement of messengers along these roads, and the steady progress of caravans across the land, and in the flow of information that connected distant places, the Persian Empire found a way to bridge the challenges of distance, transforming its vast territory into a connected whole, where the movement of ideas, goods, and authority created a network that supported its continued existence. This system of roads and communication did more than facilitate control, for it shaped the experience of those who lived within the empire, providing opportunities for interaction, for exchange, and for the sharing of knowledge. And through these connections, the empire became not only a political structure, but a network of relationships that extended across regions and cultures. And so, across the mountains, deserts, and plains, the roads of Persia carried more than travelers. They carried the life of the empire itself, linking its many parts into a single system. And in this movement, the strength of the empire was sustained, not only by the power of its rulers, but by the connections that allowed it to function, to adapt, and to enter across the vast and varied lands it encompassed. As the Persian Empire extended across vast regions, connecting lands that had long been shaped by their own traditions, languages, and beliefs, the question of identity became not one of uniformity, but of balance, for within this expansive world, unity did not depend on the removal of difference, but on the ability to allow diverse cultures to exist within a shared framework. And at the heart of this approach lay a system of thought that placed great importance on order, truth, and the continuous struggle between harmony and disorder, ideas that found their most developed expression in the spiritual traditions of the Persian world. These traditions, one of the most influential was the belief system associated with Zoroaster, also known as Zarathustra, figure whose teachings are believed to have emerged in the eastern regions of the Iranian plateau, though the exact time of his life remains uncertain. And within these teachings, the world was understood as a place shaped by the interaction of opposing forces, not as a chaotic conflict, but as a structured balance between truth and falsehood, between order and disorder. And at the center of this understanding stood Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, who represented truth, light, and the sustaining order of the universe. And this system, often referred to as Zoroastrianism. The individual played an active role in maintaining balance, for every thought, word, and action contributed to the ongoing state of the world, and to live rightly was to choose truth, to act with integrity, and to support the forces of order. And this emphasis on personal responsibility created a moral framework that extended beyond ritual, shaping daily behavior and social relationships, encouraging honesty, fairness, and respect. Fire held a special place within these beliefs, not as an object of worship, but as a symbol of purity, clarity, and the presence of truth. And within fire temple, flame was kept burning continuously, representing the enduring nature of order, and the care taken to maintain this flame reflected the broader responsibility to preserve balance within the world. And in this quiet, steady presence, the flame became a reminder of continuity and vigilance. The influence of these ideas extended into the governance of the empire, for the king was seen not only as a political leader, but as a protector of order, one who was responsible for upholding truth and ensuring that justice prevailed. And in inscriptions left by rulers such as Darius, there is a clear emphasis on the rejection of falsehood and the promotion of fairness, reflecting a connection between spiritual belief and administrative practice, where governance was understood as part of the larger balance of the world. At the same time, the Persian approach to belief was not one of exclusivity, for within the empire existed a wide variety of religious practices, from the traditions of Mesopotamia and Egypt to the beliefs of the peoples of Central Asia and the Indus region. And rather than imposing a single system, the Persian rulers generally allowed these traditions to continue, supporting local temples, respecting established practices, and integrating different forms of worship into the broader structure of the empire. This policy of tolerance contributed to stability, for it allowed communities to maintain their identities while participating in the larger system, reducing resistance and fostering cooperation. And in this way, the cultural life of the empire remained rich and varied, with different regions contributing their own forms of art, ritual, and expression. The artistic traditions of the Persian Empire reflected this diversity, combining influences from different regions into a style that was both distinctive and inclusive. And in places such as Persepolis, reliefs depict representatives from across the empire, each bringing tribute, dressed in their own traditional clothing, carrying objects that reflect their local culture. And these images convey not only the wealth of the empire, but also its unity, a visual representation of many peoples connected within a single system. Language, too, played a role in maintaining this balance, for while Old Persian was used in royal inscriptions, other languages such as Elamite, Akkadian, and Aramaic were employed in administration and communication, allowing the empire to function across linguistic boundaries. And this multilingual approach ensured that information could be understood and shared effectively, reinforcing the connections between different regions. The strong life within the empire was shaped by these cultural and spiritual influences, for individuals lived within communities that combined local traditions with broader imperial structures, participating in rituals, festivals, and practices that reflected both their immediate environment and their place within the larger world. And through these shared experiences, a sense of continuity was maintained, linking the past with the present. The emphasis on balance, so central to Persian belief, also extended to the natural world, for there was a recognition of the importance of maintaining harmony with the environment, of respecting water, land, and the cycles of nature. And this understanding influenced practices related to agriculture, settlement, and resource management, encouraging sustainability and careful use of the land. In considering the culture and beliefs of the Persian Empire, it becomes clear that its strength lay not only in its political and administrative systems, but in the ideas that guided its approach to life, ideas that emphasized order, truth, and the responsibility of individuals to contribute to the stability of the world. And through these principles, the empire was able to maintain a sense of coherence across its vast and diverse territories. And so, within the temples, the homes, and the daily lives of its people. The Persian world found a way to integrate belief with practice, to connect the spiritual with the practical, and to create a culture that valued balance and continuity. And in this integration, the foundations of its enduring influence were strengthened, shaping not only the empire itself, but the traditions that would continue long after its time had passed. As the Persian Empire expanded across vast territories, its presence was not only carried through roads, messages, and administration, but also expressed through the spaces where authority gathered, where decisions were made, and where the identity of the empire took visible form. And these spaces were not limited to a single capital, where the Persian system did not rely on one fixed center, but moved between several cities, each with its own purpose, its own rhythm, and its own role within the wider structure of governance. And in this movement, the empire revealed a different understanding of power, one that was not confined to a single place, but distributed across a network of centers connected by shared authority. The string cities, Susa held a central position, located near the western edge of the Iranian plateau, close to the lands of Mesopotamia, and its location made it a place of connection, a meeting point between different regions, where administrative activities were carried out and where communication flowed between east and west. And within Susa, the structures of governance were both practical and symbolic, reflecting the organized nature of the empire while also demonstrating its reach and influence. Further inland, in the heart of the Persian homeland, they pass Argadi, the city associated with Cyrus the Great, and though it was not as large or as elaborate as later centers, it held deep significance, for it represented the origins of the empire, the place where the foundations of Persian rule had been established. And within its layout, there was a sense of openness, with structure set within gardens and spaces that blended the built environment with the natural world, creating a setting that reflected both authority and balance. This empire developed. New centers were created that reflected its growing complexity, and among these, Persepolis stands as one of the most remarkable, not as a city of everyday life, but as a ceremonial center, place where the identity of the empire was displayed and affirmed, and built on a raised platform. Overlooking the surrounding landscape, Persepolis was designed to impress, with grand staircases, tall columns, and detailed reliefs that depicted the peoples of the empire bringing tribute, each figure carefully carved, representing different regions, different traditions, and different contributions. And through these images, the unity of the empire was expressed not through uniformity, but through the gathering of diversity under a single authority. The architecture of Persepolis combined elements from different cultural traditions, reflecting the inclusive nature of the empire, with influences from Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Iranian plateau itself. And this blending of styles created a visual language that was both unique and representative of the empire as a whole. And in the design of its halls and spaces, there was a sense of order, a symmetry, and a balance, reinforcing the ideas that guided Persian governance. The Apadana, one of the central halls of Persepolis, served as a place for audiences and ceremonies, with its forest of columns supporting a vast roof, creating a space where representatives from across the empire could gather. And the scale of this hall, combined with the detail of its decorations, conveyed both the power of the king and the breadth of the empire, reminding those who entered of the connections that bound them together. The cities were not isolated from the life of the empire, but were connected through the same networks of roads and communication that supported administration, allowing officials, envoys, and travelers to move between them, carrying information, goods, and ideas. And through this movement, the different centers remained linked, each contributing to the overall functioning of the empire. The use of multiple capitals also allowed the empire to respond to the practical realities of its size, for by moving between centers, the king and the court could maintain a presence in different regions, reinforcing authority and ensuring that no area was too distant from the central power. And this mobility created a dynamic form of governance, one that adapted to the geography of the empire rather than attempting to impose a fixed structure upon it. In addition to their administrative and ceremonial roles, these cities also served as places of cultural exchange, where different traditions met and interacted, where artisans from various regions contributed to construction and decoration, and where ideas could be shared and adapted, creating an environment that reflected the diversity of the empire. The materials used in construction, from stone and wood to precious metals and decorative elements, were often sourced from different parts of the empire, demonstrating the reach of its resources and the coordination required to bring them together. And in this gathering of materials, the physical structures of the cities became a reflection of the empire itself, composed of many parts working together to create a unified whole. The presence of gardens within these spaces, particularly in places like Pasargadae, also reflects an important aspect of Persian culture, for these cultivated landscapes, with their careful arrangement of water, plants, and pathways, represented an ideal of order within nature, a controlled and harmonious environment that mirrored the broader goals of governance, and the concept that the garden would continue to influence Persian and later traditions, symbolizing both beauty and balance. Considering the cities of the Persian Empire, it becomes clear that they were not simply places of residence or administration, but expressions of the broader vision, where architecture, space, and design were used to convey ideas about order, unity, and the relationship between power and the world. And through these cities, the empire made visible the principles that guided it. Across the plateau and beyond, ensues Pasargadae, Persepolis, and other centers, the presence of the empire was felt not only in the actions of its rulers, but in the spaces they created, spaces that brought together the many elements of the Persian world. And in this gathering, the identity of the empire was shaped, not as a single form, but as a network of places connected by shared purpose, carrying forward the balance and structure that defined its existence. As the Persian Empire reached its fullest extent, stretching from the shores of the Mediterranean to the distant regions of Central Asia and the Indus Valley, it became more than a political entity. It became a bridge between worlds, connecting regions that had long developed in relative isolation. And through this connection, the empire played a central role in shaping the flow of goods, ideas, and cultural practices across a vast portion of the ancient world, creating a network of interaction that extended far beyond its own border. To the west, the empire encompassed the lands of Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and Egypt, regions with long-established traditions of urban life, writing, and administration. And within these areas, the Persian approach was not to replace existing systems, but to incorporate them, maintaining local practices while integrating them into the broader imperial framework. And through this process, the knowledge and achievements of these civilizations became part of a shared system, accessible across different parts of the empire. In Egypt, for example, Persian rulers adopted many aspects of local tradition, presenting themselves in ways that align with Egyptian concepts of kingship, and supporting temples and religious practices, ensuring continuity while maintaining their authority. And this approach allowed the region to function within the empire without losing its identity, demonstrating the adaptability of Persian governance. To the east, the empire extended into regions that connected with the Indus Valley, bringing it into contact with cultures that had developed along the river systems of South Asia. And through these connections, trade routes were established that allowed the movement of goods such as textiles, spices, precious stones, and metals, linking the resources of different regions and creating an interconnected economic system that spanned continents. The Persian presence in the Indus region is reflected in administrative practices and in the use of standardized systems, suggesting that the influence of the empire extended into local governance, while also facilitating exchange between the Indian subcontinent and the western regions of the empire. And through this interaction, new forms of cultural and economic connection emerged. To the north, the empire reached into Central Asia, a region characterized by open landscapes and mobile populations. And here, Persian system adapted to different conditions, interacting with groups whose ways of life were shaped by movement rather than settlement. And through these interactions, the empire extended its influence into areas that were connected by trade routes that would later form part of the broader networks linking east and west. Along the western edge of the empire, the Persian world came into contact with the Greek city-states located along the coasts of Anatolia and across the Aegean Sea, and these interactions were complex, involving trade, cultural exchange, and eventually conflict, as differing systems of organization and identity came into contact. And while these tensions would later lead to the Persian Wars, they also created opportunities for exchange, as goods, ideas, and artistic influences moved between regions. The role of the Persian Empire as a connector was not limited to land routes, for its access to seas and rivers allowed for maritime trade as well, linking coastal regions and facilitating the movement of goods across water. And through these connections, the empire became part of a wider network that extended beyond its own border, interacting with regions that were not directly under its control. This strength in the empire was supported by the infrastructure that had been developed, including roads, storage facilities, and administrative systems, allowing merchants to move goods with a degree of security and predictability. And this environment encouraged economic activity, as individuals and communities participated in the exchange of resources, contributing to the overall prosperity of the empire. This string of goods was accompanied by the movement of ideas, as artisans, scholars, and travelers carried knowledge from one region to another, influencing practices in areas such as art, architecture, and technology. And through this exchange, the cultures within the empire were not static, but dynamic, evolving through interaction and adaptation. The string styles, for example, show evidence of this blending, with motifs and techniques appearing across different regions, reflecting both local traditions and broader influences. And in this way, the empire became a space where cultural elements could meet and combine, creating new forms that carried the imprint of multiple sources. The administrative systems of the empire also facilitated interaction, for the use of multiple languages and standardized practices allowed communication across regions, reducing barriers and enabling cooperation. And through these systems, the empire maintained a level of cohesion that supported its role as a connector between different parts of the ancient world. Diplomatic relations played a role as well, as the Persian Empire engaged with neighboring states and regions, negotiating agreements, establishing alliances, and managing conflicts. And through these interactions, it participated in a broader political landscape, influencing and being influenced by the dynamics of the surrounding world. In considering the role of Persia within this wider context, it becomes clear that its significance lies not only in its size or its power, but in its ability to bring together different regions, creating connections that allowed for the exchange of goods, ideas, and practices. And through this role, the empire contributed to the development of a more interconnected world. And so, across its vast expanse, the Persian Empire served as a bridge, linking distant lands and diverse peoples. And in this connection, it created a network that extended beyond its own boundaries, shaping the interactions of the ancient world and leaving a legacy of exchange and integration that would continue long after its time had passed. As the Persian Empire extended its reach westward into Anatolia and along the eastern shores of the Aegean, it entered a region where small, independent city-states had developed their own distinct ways of organizing society, and among these were the Greek polis, communities that valued autonomy, local identity, and participation in governance. And while the Persian system had been shaped by integration and administration across vast territories, the Greek world was characterized by fragmentation, with each city maintaining its own laws, traditions, and alliances. And it was within this meeting of different structures that tension began to emerge, not as a sudden clash, but as a gradual unfolding of differences in approach, identity, and power. The cities of Ionia, located along the western coast of Anatolia, were among the first points of contact between the Persian Empire and the Greek world, and these cities, though culturally Greek, had come under Persian control as part of the expansion into Lydia, and within this arrangement, local rulers were often allowed to maintain authority, provided they remained loyal to the empire, and for time, this balance allowed the region to function within the broader Persian system, benefiting from the stability and connections that the empire provided. Yet, beneath the surface of stability, there were tensions, for the traditions of autonomy within the Greek cities did not always align with the structure of imperial rule, and in the late 6th century BCE, these tensions led to the Ionian Revolt, a series of uprisings against Persian authority, supported in part by mainland Greek cities such as Athens, and while the revolt was eventually suppressed, it marked a turning point, where it brought the Persian Empire into direct conflict with the Greek mainland, setting the stage for further encounters. In response to these events, Persian leadership sought to secure its western frontier, not only to prevent further uprisings, but also to reinforce its authority, and this led to expeditions into the Greek mainland, where the differing systems of organization became more apparent. For while the Persian forces represented a centralized empire, the Greek city-states operated independently, sometimes cooperating, sometimes divided, and this contrast influenced the nature of the conflict that followed. The encounter at Marathon, often remembered as one of the early major confrontations, illustrates these differences, for the Persian forces, operating within a structured imperial system, faced a coalition of Greek forces that, despite their independence, were able to unite in response to a common threat. And while the outcome of this encounter favored the Greek, it did not resolve the broader tension, but rather set the stage for further interactions. The subsequent campaigns, including those led by Xerxes, extended the scope of the conflict, bringing larger forces and more complex strategies into play. And battles such as Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea have been recorded in various sources, often emphasizing different perspectives. And while these events are often presented as decisive moments, they are better understood as part of an ongoing process, where both sides sought to assert their position within a shared region. From the perspective of the Persian Empire, these campaigns were part of maintaining stability and securing borders, consistent with its approach to governance, while from the Greek perspective, they were seen as efforts to preserve autonomy and identity. And in this difference of perspective, the nature of the conflict becomes clearer, not simply as a struggle for territory, but as an interaction between different ways of organizing society. Despite the conflicts, the relationship between Persia and the Greek world was not defined solely by opposition, for there were also periods of exchange, where trade continued, and cultural influences moved between regions, and Greek mercenaries served within Persian forces, while Persian goods and ideas reached Greek cities, creating a complex relationship that included both cooperation and competition. The artistic and cultural exchange between these regions can be seen in various forms, from the adoption of certain motifs in art to the sharing of techniques in architecture and craftsmanship. And through these interactions, both sides were influenced by the other, contributing to the broader development of the ancient world. Within the Persian Empire, the conflicts with Greece were only one aspect of a much larger system, where the empire continued to manage its vast territories, maintaining administration, trade, and communication across regions that extended far beyond the Aegean. And while the western frontier presented challenges, it did not define the entirety of the empire's experience. The ability of the Persian system to absorb and adapt to different conditions allowed it to continue functioning despite these conflicts, and the lessons learned from these encounters influenced later developments, shaping strategies and approaches to governance and interaction. Considering the relationship between Persia and Greece, it becomes clear that it was not a simple opposition, but a complex interaction between different systems, each with its own strengths and limitations. And through this interaction, both were shaped in ways that would influence their future development. The strength along the western edges of the empire where the lands of Persia met the world of the Greek city-states. The story of connection and conflict unfolded, not as a single narrative, but as a series of encounters that reflected the diversity of the ancient world. And in these encounters, the Persian Empire continued to navigate the balance between integration and independence, shaping its presence within a region defined by both unity and difference. Beyond the grand structures of government, the movement of armies, and the decisions made within royal courts, the Persian Empire was sustained by something quieter and more constant: the daily lives of the people who lived within its vast territories. For it was in the fields, the workshops, the marketplaces, and the homes true rhythm of the empire unfolded. And through these everyday patterns, the structures of administration, trade, and culture took on meaning, shaping how individuals experienced their place within a world that extended far beyond their immediate surroundings. Across the Iranian plateau, and the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, along the Nile, and in the regions reaching toward the Indus, life followed the cycles of nature, shaped by the seasons, by the availability of water, and by the demands of agriculture. And for many, the year was divided into periods of planting, tending, and harvesting, each phase requiring careful attention, and the knowledge needed to manage these cycles was passed through generations, creating a continuity that linked the present to the past. Farmers worked the land using techniques adapted to their environment, in some regions relying on river irrigation, and others making use of underground water channels, and crops such as wheat, barley, dates, and various fruits formed the basis of sustenance, while animals provided additional resources, from meat and milk to wool and labor. And through this combination, communities were able to maintain a degree of stability, even within a landscape that could be unpredictable. The streets and cities, the rhythm of life took on a different form, with markets serving the centers of exchange, where goods from distant regions could be found alongside local products, and merchants, traders, and artisans gathered in these spaces, negotiating, selling, and sharing information, creating an environment that was both economic and social. And through these interactions, the connections between different parts of the empire became visible. Artisans played a vital role in this world, producing items that ranged from everyday tools to finely crafted objects, and their work reflected both local traditions and broader influences as techniques and styles moved across regions. And in workshops, skills were developed and refined, often passed from one generation to the next, creating a continuity of craftsmanship that contributed to the cultural identity of the empire. The diversity of the Persian Empire was evident in the variety of languages spoken, the forms of dress, and the customs practiced, for each region maintained its own tradition, and while there were shared elements that connected them, there was no single way of life that defined the entire empire, and this diversity was not seen as a weakness, but as a characteristic that could be integrated within the broader system. Communication between regions, supported by the network of roads and administrative systems, allowed goods and information to move, but it also allowed people to travel, and through this movement, individuals encountered different cultures, expanding their understanding of the world and contributing to the exchange of ideas that shaped the empire. The strength of the administration was felt in various ways, from the collection of taxes to the maintenance of order. And while these structures were often distant from the daily concerns of individuals, they provided a framework within which life could continue, ensuring that resources were managed and that stability was maintained. And for many, the system offered a degree of predictability that supported their activities. The stringent practices were woven into daily life, with rituals, festivals, and personal beliefs shaping how individuals understood their place in the world. And while the forms of worship varied across regions, there was often a shared emphasis on maintaining balance, on respecting the forces of nature, and on living in accordance with principles that supported harmony. This family served as a central unit within society, providing support, continuity, and the transmission of knowledge. And within households, roles were defined by tradition and necessity. with responsibilities shared in ways that allowed the community to function. And through these relationships, the structures of society were maintained. Trade, both local and long distance, played a significant role in shaping daily life, for the availability of goods from different regions expanded the range of materials and products that people could access, and through this exchange, the empire became a space of interaction, where the movement of goods was accompanied by the movement of ideas. The diversity of the empire also meant that experiences varied, for life in a rural village differed from life in a city, and conditions in one region could be different from those in another. Yet within this variation, there were shared elements, patterns that connected different parts of the empire, creating a sense of belonging within a larger system. In considering the daily life of the Persian Empire, it becomes clear that its strength was not only in its administration or its expansion, but in its ability to support a wide range of experiences, allowing individuals to live within their own traditions while participating in a broader network. And through this balance, the empire maintained a level of stability that supported its continued existence. This strength across its vast territories, the Persian Empire was not only a structure of power, but a living system sustained by the countless actions of individuals who worked, traded, created, and lived within its framework. And in this quiet rhythm of daily life, the foundations of the empire were reinforced, allowing it to endure across time and distance. As the Persian Empire continued across generations, sustained by systems of governance, networks of communication, and a balance between unity and diversity, there came a time when the stability it had long maintained began to shift, not through a single event, but through a gradual accumulation of changes, pressures, and transformations that altered the conditions under which the empire had once thrived. And in this process, the structure that had held together vast lands and diverse peoples began to face challenges that would reshape its future. The structures, by their nature, depend on balance, on the ability to manage resources, maintain communication, and ensure cooperation across distances. And over time, this balance can become more difficult to sustain, for as territories expand, the complexity of administration increases, requiring greater coordination and more refined systems, and even well-established structures can be strained when faced with changing conditions. Within the Persian Empire, the system of satrapies had allowed for effective regional governance, yet it also introduced the possibility of fragmentation, for the distance between the central authority and local regions meant that satraps often exercised significant power within their territories. And while mechanisms of oversight were in place, maintaining consistent control across such a vast expanse required constant attention. And over time, variations in loyalty and administration could begin to emerge. The strict economic demands of maintaining the empire also played a role, for the need to support administration, infrastructure, and the military required resources. And while the system of taxation had been designed to distribute this burden, fluctuations in production, trade, and local conditions could affect the stability of the system, creating pressures that needed to be managed carefully. The external challenges also became more prominent as the empire interacted with neighboring regions and powers, and while the Persian system had been effective in integrating diverse territories, it was not immune to conflict, and along its borders, encounters with other states, including the Greek world, continued to shape its strategic considerations, requiring attention and resources that could influence internal stability. In the later periods of the empire, changes in leadership also contributed to shifts in governance, for each ruler brought their own approach to administration, and while some continued the traditions established by earlier kings, others faced difficulties in maintaining the same level of cohesion, and the continuity of leadership, so important for stability, could be affected by succession challenges and internal disputes. Despite these pressures, the empire remained a significant force, with established systems that continued to function, and its presence across multiple regions ensured that it remained an important part of the ancient world. Yet the combination of internal and external factors gradually created conditions in which transformation became inevitable. It was within this context that the rise of a new power in the West began to intersect with the Persian world, a power associated with the Macedonian kingdom under the leadership of Alexander. As his campaigns extended eastward, it brought him into direct contact with the Persian Empire, leading to a series of encounters that would alter the balance of power in the region. The campaigns of Alexander, marked by a combination of military strategy and the movement of forces across great distances, led to the defeat of Persian armies in key engagements and the capture of important centers, including the ceremonial city of Persepolis. And while these events are often presented as decisive, they were part of a broader process of transition in which the structures of one system were replaced or adapted within another. The strength of the Achaemenid Empire did not mean the disappearance of the systems and traditions that had defined it, for many of its administrative practices, cultural elements, and ideas were incorporated into the new structures that followed, demonstrating the continuity that often underlies periods of change. And through this integration, the influence of Persia extended beyond its political existence. The transformation of the empire also reflects a broader pattern in history, where systems evolve, adapt, and are reshaped by new conditions, and where the legacy of one period becomes part of the foundation for the next. And in the sense, the decline of the Persian Empire can be seen not only as an end, but as a transition, a movement from one form of organization to another. The physical remains of the empire, its cities, roads, and structures, continued to influence the landscape, while its administrative concepts and cultural practices persisted in various forms, contributing to the development of later states and empires. And through these continuities, the impact of Persia remained present. In reflecting on the transformation of the Persian Empire, it becomes clear that its strength lay not only in its ability to expand, but in the systems it created, systems that could be adapted and carried forward. And even as its political structure changed, the ideas and practices it developed continued to shape the world. And so, the story of the Persian Empire moves into a period of change, where the structures that once defined it gave way to new forms, yet its influence remains, woven into the patterns of history and carried forward into the future, demonstrating that while empires may transform, the legacies they create continue to endure. When the structures of the Persian Empire began to dissolve, when its palaces were no longer centers of authority and its kings no longer ruled across vast distances, what remained was not silence, but continuity, for the influence of the empire did not vanish with its political form, but continued quietly, carried through systems, ideas, and memories that had been shaped over centuries. And in this way, Persia did not end, it transformed, leaving behind a legacy that would echo through time, shaping the worlds that followed. The strength of the Persian Empire had never been based solely on conquest or control, but on its ability to create order across diversity, to connect distant regions without erasing their identities. And this approach to governance became one of its most lasting contributions, for the idea that an empire could function through cooperation, through local administration, and through respect for cultural variation would influence later states, offering a model for managing complexity on a large scale. The strength of satrapies, which allowed regions to be governed locally while remaining part of a broader structure, provided a framework that could be adapted by those who came after. And even as new powers rose, the practicality of such systems ensured that they continued to be used, demonstrating how administrative ideas can outlast the political entities that first created them. The roads that once carried royal messengers across the empire continued to serve as pathways for movement, connecting cities and regions, and the concept of organized communication, ensuring that information could travel reliably across distances, became an essential element of governance in later societies, reflecting the enduring importance of connection. The standardization of weights, measures, and systems of exchange also left a lasting imprint, for these practices facilitated trade and interaction, creating predictability that supported economic activity. And as trade networks expanded in later periods, these foundational ideas continued to shape how goods were exchanged and how value was understood. The Persian Empire contributed to a broader pattern of interaction between different regions, for by bringing together diverse peoples, it created opportunities for exchange, allowing ideas, artistic styles, and technologies to move across boundaries. And this process of cultural blending would continue in various forms, shaping the development of societies across a wide area. The artistic achievements of Persia, seen in the reliefs of Persepolis, in the craftsmanship of its artisans, and in the subtle blending of influences from different regions, reflect a civilization that valued both precision and harmony. And these aesthetic principles influenced later artistic traditions, contributing to a shared visual language that extended beyond the empire itself. Religious and philosophical ideas also played a role in shaping the legacy of Persia, particularly the concepts associated with Zoroastrianism, which emphasized the balance between order and chaos, truth and falsehood. And these ideas, centered on moral choice and responsibility, would resonate in various forms, influencing later belief systems and contributing to broader philosophical traditions. Even the memory of Persian kingship, of rulers who saw themselves as guardians of order rather than simply wielders of power, contributed to the development of ideas about leadership, suggesting that authority carried responsibility, and that the role of a ruler was to maintain balance rather than impose control, an idea that would appear in different forms across history. As new empires emerged, from the Hellenistic kingdoms to later Persian dynasties and beyond, elements of the Achaemenid system were adapted, reinterpreted, and continued, showing that the influence of Persia was not confined to a single period, but extended across time, shaping the evolution of governance, culture, and thought. The landscapes once governed by Persia, from the plateaus to the river valleys, continued to bear traces of its presence in the remnants of structures, in the patterns of settlement, and in the traditions that persisted, linking the past to the present. And through these connections, the memory of the empire remained part of the living world. History often remembers empires through their rise and fall, through the moments of expansion and decline, that the true measure of their impact lies in what endures, in the systems that continue, in the ideas that persist, and in the ways in which they shape the future. And in this sense, the Persian Empire stands as a powerful example of continuity, how a civilization can influence the world long after its political form has changed. The strength who lived within its boundaries, the empire was not an abstract concept, but a lived reality, framework that shaped their daily lives, their interaction, and their understanding of the world, and through their actions, through their work, their trade, and their traditions, they contributed to a system that extended far beyond their immediate experience, creating a shared world that connected distant regions. And as time moved forward, as new powers rose and new systems emerged, the legacy of Persia continued to flow beneath the surface, like a quiet current, influencing the structures and ideas that followed, reminding us that history is not a series of isolated moments, but a continuous process, where each era builds upon the one before. In the end, the story of Persia is not only the story of an empire, but the story of connection, how diverse peoples can be brought together, how systems can be created to manage complexity, and of how ideas can endure beyond the boundaries of time. And in this enduring presence, the Persian Empire remains, not as a distant memory, but as a part of the foundation upon which much of the ancient world was built. As the landscapes of the Iranian plateau continue to stretch beneath the same wide sky, as the paths once traveled by messengers and merchants remain etched into the land, the legacy of Persia lingers, not in monuments alone, but in the patterns of thought, governance, and culture that continue to shape the world, a reminder that even as empires fade, the ideas they leave behind continue to endure, carried forward by the steady, unbroken flow of time.